There is a verse in the very first book of the Bible that scholars have argued about for more than 2,000 years. It is only a handful of sentences long. It sits quietly between the story of Adam's descendants and the story of Noah's Ark, almost as if someone hoped you would read past it without stopping. Most people do. Most people have heard the story of the garden and the story of the flood, and they assume they know everything that happened in between. But you have almost certainly never been told the full truth about Genesis chapter 6. You have never been told what those 4 short verses actually describe, or why the ancient rabbis lowered their voices when they spoke of them, or why entire books that explained this passage were quietly removed from the scriptures your grandparents were handed in church. Here is what the text says. In the days when humanity began to multiply across the face of the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took as wives whomever they chose. And then comes the sentence that has unsettled translators, priests, and theologians for millennia. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Read that again, slowly. Sons of God, coming down to take human wives, giants born from the union, mighty men of renown. And then, immediately, in the very next breath, the text says that God looked upon the earth and saw that the wickedness of mankind was great, that every thought of the human heart was only evil continually, and that he regretted ever having made them. So he resolved to wipe them from the face of the world with water. Do you see the connection that almost everyone misses? The flood does not appear out of nowhere. It does not come as a vague punishment for ordinary human sin. It comes immediately after this strange, half-told account of heavenly beings descending to earth and fathering a race of giants. The two events are bound together. The corruption that drowned the world begins with whatever happened in Genesis 6. And the Bible, in its final form, will not tell you what that was. It gives you 4 verses, and then it looks away. But there were other books, older books that the earliest followers of this faith read as scripture, quoted with reverence, and treated as holy. Books that named the beings who descended. Books that described in terrifying detail what they taught humanity, what their monstrous children did to the world, and why the heavens themselves cried out for the world to be cleansed. These texts were called the Book of the Watchers, the Book of Giants, the Book of Jubilees. They were read in synagogues and quoted by apostles. And then, over the centuries, they were pushed to the margins, declared too dangerous, too strange, and finally cut away, until almost no one remembered they had ever existed. By the end of this story, you will understand something most people who have read the Bible their entire lives have never grasped. You will understand why a single sentence about the sons of God is, in the words of more than one scholar, the verse that breaks the Bible, the verse that forces you to choose between 2 completely different visions of what the ancient world believed about heaven, about angels, about the boundary between the divine and the human, and about why a loving God once decided to undo his own creation. And consider this, before we go any further, because it is the detail that should unsettle you most. The book that explained all of this, the Book of Enoch, was not some heretical text scribbled in the margins by a fringe sect. It was quoted by name in the New Testament itself. One of its prophecies is repeated almost word for word in the letter of Jude, near the very back of the Bible most people own. The earliest followers of the faith read it. They revered it. They built their understanding of angels and judgment and the end of days upon it. And then, over the span of a few centuries, it was allowed to slip away, not burned in a single great purge, but quietly set aside, left uncopied, declared unsuitable, until it vanished so completely from the Western world that for over 1,000 years it was believed to be lost forever, surviving only in a handful of quotations and in the memory of a single distant church that had refused to let it go. What was in that book? that the tradition first treasured it and then could not bear to keep it. You are about to find out. You will learn the names of the ones who fell. You will learn what they whispered to humanity in the shadow of a mountain. You will learn what was born from that union, and what those children became after death, and whether, according to the oldest traditions, they walk among us still. So settle in, let the lights grow dim, let the noise of the day fall away. We are going to travel back to a time before the flood, before recorded history, to the world as it was in those days, and also afterward. And we are going to look directly at the thing the text wanted you to look away from. So without further ado, let us begin, shall we? To understand what was lost, you must first imagine what once was. And to do that, you have to unlearn the way you picture the ancient past. We tend to imagine the world before the flood as something crude and primitive, small bands of people in animal skins, struggling against a dark and empty wilderness. But that is not the world the old traditions describe. The world before the flood, in the memory of these texts, was a younger world, yes, but not a poorer one. It was a world still close to its source. The seam between heaven and earth had not yet been sewn shut. The distance between the divine and the human, which feels so vast to us now, was in those days only a thin veil, and in some places no veil at all. Picture the night sky as it must have looked then. No cities glowing on the horizon, no haze of smoke or dust. The darkness above was absolute, and against that darkness the stars burned with a clarity we can scarcely conceive of now. The people of that age did not see the stars the way we do, as distant suns separated from us by unimaginable emptiness. They saw them as lights with purpose. They saw them as watchers, and in a sense, they were right. For in the heavens above this young and gleaming world, there were beings whose entire reason for existence was attention. The old texts call them by a name that has come down to us almost untranslated, a name that carries its meaning openly, the Watchers. In Aramaic, Irin. In Greek, egregoroi, the ones who watch, the ones who do not sleep. They were among the highest orders of the angelic host, and their assignment was both simple and immense. They were to observe the world. They were to guard the order of creation. They were to stand at the boundary between the holy realm and the realm of men, and to keep that boundary whole. Imagine what that station must have been. To stand at the edge of heaven and look down upon a world still warm from the hand that made it, to watch the first rivers carve their valleys, to watch the first forests rise and spread their canopies toward a younger sun, to watch the first human families gather around the first fires, learning to speak, to sing, to grieve, to love. The Watchers saw all of it. They were custodians of a creation that was still being written, and there was, in the beginning, a profound beauty in their vigil. They were the eyes of heaven, lovingly fixed upon a world that did not yet know it was being seen. And the world they watched was, by every account, a place of astonishing fertility and order. The Book of Jubilees, that ancient retelling of Genesis, describes the early generations of mankind as long-lived and numerous, spreading across the land, building, planting, naming the animals and the places, passing down knowledge from father to son. Adam's line did not vanish into darkness after the garden. It flourished. Cities rose. Crafts were learned. The children of men filled the valleys and the plains. And they lived, the old genealogies insist, for a very long time. This is one of the strange and haunting features of that early world. The men of the generations before the flood lived for centuries. The line of Adam is recorded in ages that stagger the modern ear. Adam himself living more than 900 years, and Seth and Enoch, and the long succession down to Methuselah, who is remembered as the longest lived of them all, nearly 1,000 years upon the earth. Whatever we make of those numbers, the meaning they carried for the ancient reader is unmistakable. The world before the flood was a world still close to its origin, and closeness to the origin meant length of life. Death had entered the world in the garden. Yes, but it had not yet fully tightened its grip. The early generations lived in a kind of long twilight of the first creation, their years stretching out across spans we can no longer imagine, their memories reaching back almost to the beginning. A man in those days might remember his great-great-grandfather, and that grandfather might have spoken with one who had walked with Adam. The whole of human history, in that early age, could be held in a few overlapping lifetimes. The world was young, and its people were long-lived, and the knowledge of the beginning was still fresh in living memory. And running through that long-lived world were two lines, two streams of humanity that the old texts are careful to distinguish. There was the line of Cain, the firstborn, who had murdered his brother, and whose descendants, the texts suggest, turned increasingly toward the building of cities, the forging of tools, the making of music and metal, and the things of this world. And there was the line of Seth, the son given to Adam and Eve in place of the murdered Abel, the line through which the memory of God was kept, the line of those who, as Genesis puts it, began to call upon the name of the Lord. And in the line of Seth stood Enoch, the seventh, the one who walked with God and was taken. For a long time, these two streams of humanity flowed on, distinct, the worldly and the faithful, the city builders and the God-callers, and the world held its shape, and the boundaries held, and the long centuries turned. There is a stillness to this part of the story that the old writers clearly cherished. Before the rupture, there was a kind of cosmic quiet, a sense that everything was held in its proper place. The angels in their courses above, humanity in its appointed sphere below, the sun rising and setting in obedience, the seasons turning as they were commanded to turn. The boundary between heaven and earth was respected, and because it was respected, the world remained whole. It is worth pausing here, because this idea of boundary is the hidden key to everything that follows. The ancient mind understood creation not as a single uniform thing, but as a series of distinct realms, each with its own nature, each separated from the others by lines that were never meant to be crossed. The waters above were divided from the waters below. The light was divided from the darkness. The dry land was divided from the sea. The sacred was divided from the common, and the heavenly beings were divided from the earthly ones. To the people who first told this story, the goodness of the world was not only in the things that filled it, but in the order that kept those things apart. A world in which everything stayed in its place was a world that was safe. A world in which the boundaries held was a world in which life could flourish. To grasp how the watchers fit into this ordered world, you have to set aside the flat picture. Most of us inherit a single heaven, somewhere above the clouds, populated by indistinct figures with wings. The world the old texts describe was layered, structured, alive with rank and purpose. Above the earth rose the heavens, level upon level, and through them moved the host, the armies of heaven, the stars and the spirits, the messengers and the ministers. At the summit stood the throne, the seat of the Most High, surrounded by the burning ones and the cherubim, by fire and crystal, and a brightness no eye could bear. And ranged through the lower heavens, nearer to the world of men, stood the orders, whose work was the maintenance of creation, the angels of the seasons, of the rain and the frost, of the courses of the sun and moon, of the thunder and the sea. Each had its station. Each kept its boundary. The whole vast machine of the heavens turned in obedience, and not one part reached for the work of another. And among these orders, set nearest of all to the world they served, stood the watchers. They were not the highest of the heavenly beings, but they were among the most intimately bound to the earth, precisely because their work was the earth. The Book of Jubilees preserves a detail that makes their fall all the more tragic. In the oldest tradition, the watchers were originally sent down to the earth not to seize it, but to help it. They came, Jubilees says, to instruct the children of men, to teach them to do what was right and just upon the earth, to guide the young human race toward goodness. They were sent as teachers, as guardians, as shepherds of a world still learning to walk. Their descent was not at first a crime at all. It was a commission. They were meant to be near humanity, to lift it up, to pass down the wisdom of heaven in its proper measure and season. And there it is, the seed of the whole catastrophe, hidden inside the mercy of their mission. They were given the most dangerous gift heaven can give, closeness. They were sent down among the very ones they were meant to guard. The boundary they would one day break was a boundary they had been brought by their own holy errand, right up against. They were placed at the edge of the line, not to cross it, but to keep it, and to keep a line you must stand close enough to touch it. The watchers stood at that line for generations, teaching, guarding, helping. And the longer they stood there, the thinner the line began to feel. There was, in those days, one human being who understood the heavens better than any other, and his story runs like a bright thread through the whole dark tapestry that follows, so we should meet him now, before the fall. His name was Enoch, the seventh in the line of Adam, the son of Jared, the father of Methuselah. Genesis gives him only a few words, but they are among the strangest in the whole book. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. He did not die, like the others in the long genealogy. He was taken, and the older traditions tell us why and where. Enoch, they say, was a man of extraordinary righteousness in an age that was beginning to rot. He did not give himself to the corruption spreading among the children of men. Instead, he walked with God, and that walking, the texts insist, was no metaphor. Enoch was lifted up. He was carried into the heavens and shown what no living man had been shown, the chambers of the stars, the storehouses of the snow and the wind, the paths of the sun and moon, the place of judgment prepared for the wicked, the throne of glory itself. He became the scribe of heaven, the one human being entrusted with the secrets of the cosmos and with the keeping of its records. He saw the order of all things from the inside. And because he saw that order whole, Enoch alone among men would understand exactly what it meant when the watchers broke it. He alone would grasp the scale of the wound. He would become the bridge between the two worlds, the man who walked with God, sent to deliver God's verdict to the angels who had fallen. But that comes later. For now, in the days of his father Jared, the world is still whole, and Enoch walks beneath a sky that has not yet cracked, in a world where the boundaries still hold and the eyes of heaven still watch in love. It is one of the quiet ironies of the whole story that the fall of the watchers is dated, in the oldest texts, to those very days, the days of Jared, the father of Enoch. Some of the ancient writers even heard the meaning of the name in it. Jared, they said, from a root that means to descend, to come down. In the days of the one whose name meant descent, the sons of heaven descended. The most righteous era and the most catastrophic crossing belonged to the same generation. The light and the breach were born together. And for a long time, longer than we can easily imagine, the boundaries held. The watchers kept their station. The 200 of them, according to the Book of Enoch, were stationed in the high places, their attention turned downward, their purpose fixed. There is no hint in the oldest accounts that they were created flawed or that rebellion was woven into them from the start. They were made for vigilance, and for a great span of time they were faithful to it. The danger, when it came, did not come from some defect placed in them at their making. It came from something far more familiar, far more human, far more quietly devastating. It came from desire. It came from looking too long, because here is the thing about watching. To watch something closely, for a long time, is to begin to love it, and to love something that is not yours, that you were only meant to guard from a distance. That is where the trouble always begins. Down below, the daughters of men were growing into their beauty. They moved through the fields in the golden light of the early world. They bathed in the rivers. They sang at their work and laughed in the evenings and wept at their losses. And all of it, every gesture, every season of their short and luminous lives, passed beneath the gaze of beings who did not age, did not die, and could not look away. The watchers were not made to feel what they began to feel. They were made to observe, not to want. But somewhere in that long vigil, observation curdled into longing. The eyes of heaven, which had been fixed on the world in love, began to be fixed on it in hunger. And there is a vast and terrible difference between the two, though from a distance they can look almost the same. We do not know how long the longing grew before it became a thought, or how long the thought lingered before it became a plan. The texts compress it into a few lines, the way old stories always compress the slow work of the heart. But we can imagine it. We can imagine one of them, for it began, as these things so often do, with one standing at the edge of the holy realm in the deep of night, looking down at a single sleeping village, and feeling for the first time the unbearable ache of being forever outside of something he had come to love. And we can imagine him beginning, very quietly, to wonder whether the boundary he was sworn to guard might after all be crossed. This is the moment the whole world turns on. Not a battle, not a dramatic act of defiance against the throne of heaven, just a longing, nursed in silence, in the dark, at the edge of everything by beings who had been given one task, to watch, and who had watched until watching was no longer enough. The golden age of the early world did not end with a war. It ended with a desire that no one spoke aloud, until one of them finally did. And once it was spoken, nothing could ever be put back in its place. So, how does a desire held in silence become the ruin of the world? How does a single forbidden thought, nursed in the dark at the edge of heaven, grow into an event so catastrophic that the Creator himself would choose to drown everything he had made? The answer is the part of the story the Bible does not tell you. For this, we have to turn to the older book, the Book of the Watchers, the first section of what we now call First Enoch. And the moment we open it, the 4 silent verses of Genesis split apart and pour out their secret. The Genesis text says only this: "The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and took wives of all that they chose." One sentence, a glance, a choice, a taking. The canon gives you the outline of a crime and nothing more. But the Book of Enoch fills in every line of that outline, and what it reveals transforms a single verse into one of the most haunting accounts in all of ancient literature. It begins, Enoch tells us, with the angels of heaven looking down and seeing the beautiful daughters of men. And one of them, their leader, a being named Shemyaza, spoke to the others of his longing. But notice what happens next, because it is the detail that changes everything. Shemyaza does not simply act, he is afraid. He says to his companions, in words that have echoed down 3,000 years, "I fear that you will not truly carry through this deed, and I alone will pay the penalty for a great sin." Read that carefully, because it tells you that these beings knew. They knew it was forbidden. They knew it was sin. They knew there would be a penalty, and a terrible one. This was not done in ignorance. This was a crossing of the boundary, undertaken with full knowledge that the boundary was sacred and that breaking it would damn them. And so, to bind themselves together so that none could turn back and none could be left to bear the guilt alone, they swore an oath. 200 of them, 200 watchers, the eyes of heaven, gathered in the days of Jared on the summit of a mountain. The text names the place. It is Mount Hermon, a real mountain, snow-crowned, standing at the northern edge of the Holy Land, its peak lost in cloud. And there, on that high and lonely place, the 200 bound themselves with mutual curses, swearing that they would descend together and do this thing together and share its consequences together. The very name of the mountain, the old tradition says, became a memorial of the oath. Hermon from the word for curse, for the swearing of an oath. The place itself was named after the moment heaven betrayed its own order. Consider what it means that the writers chose a summit for this scene. The watchers did not creep down into some hidden valley to swear their oath in secret. They gathered on the highest point of the land, the place nearest to heaven, the threshold between the realm they were leaving and the realm they were entering. A mountaintop, in the ancient imagination, was always a meeting place of worlds, the place where the divine touched the earthly, where Moses would one day receive the law, where the prophets would one day meet their God. And it was on exactly such a threshold, the place built for holy meeting, that the watchers chose to commit their unholy crossing. They took the very architecture of the sacred and turned it to the service of the breach. The mountain that should have been a place of ascent became the launching point of a descent. And the detail that they bound themselves with mutual curses, that they swore an oath of solidarity in transgression, tells us something profound about the nature of the fall. This was not the sin of one rogue spirit. It was a conspiracy. It was 200 beings agreeing together to abandon their station, each one stealing the others, each one's resolve feeding the next, until the whole company had talked itself past the point of return. There is a particular kind of evil that can only happen in groups, the evil that no single one of them might have dared alone, but that becomes possible, even easy, when the crowd has sworn the oath together, and no one wishes to be the coward who turns back. The Watchers invented that evil on the slopes of Hermon. They bound their courage to one another so that none could repent, and in binding their courage they bound their doom. Picture it. 200 shining beings descending in the night onto a mountaintop, the snow beneath them. The stars they had once tended burning overhead, indifferent now, and among them their leaders, whose names the text preserves like a charge sheet read at a trial. Shemyaza their chief, and beside him others, Arakil, Kokabil, Barakil, Asael, and the one whose name would become the most feared of all, the one the later traditions could not stop talking about, Azazel. And then they descended into the world of men, and they took wives, each choosing for himself, just as Genesis says. But the book of Enoch does not stop at the taking. It tells you what came after the taking, and this is the second secret, the one even darker than the first. Because the Watchers did not only give themselves to the daughters of men, they gave them knowledge. They opened to humanity the hidden things of heaven, the secrets that had been kept on the far side of the boundary precisely because mankind was not meant to have them yet, or perhaps ever. And here the text becomes almost an inventory of forbidden gifts, a careful list of exactly what was taught and by whom, as though the writer wanted us to understand that the true catastrophe was not the marriages at all, but the teaching. Azazel, the text says, taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. He taught them the working of metals, how to dig the bright ores from the earth and beat them into blades. Before Azazel, the old tradition implies humanity did not know war as we know it. They quarreled, surely. They sinned, as the sons of Adam had always sinned. But they did not have the instruments of slaughter. Azazel gave them the instruments. He taught the human hand to forge the weapon, and in doing so, he changed the nature of human violence forever. But Azazel did not stop at weapons. He taught women, too. And what he taught them is one of the strangest and most revealing details in the entire text. He taught them the use of antimony for the eyes, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and the working of precious stones into ornaments, and the art of cosmetics, of dyes and adornment. Why does an ancient text place the teaching of eyeshadow beside the teaching of swords, as though they were sins of the same order? Because to the writer, both were the same sin in different forms. Both were the art of making a thing appear other than it is. Both were deception. The blade that hides the intention to kill, the painted face that hides the true face. Both were ways of fracturing the honest order of the world, of severing appearance from reality. The Watchers taught humanity to make war and to make masks, and the old tradition saw these as branches of a single corrupting tree. And then came the others, each with his own dark dowry. Amezerach taught the casting of spells and the cutting of roots, the dark side of medicine, the use of the earth's hidden powers to bind and to harm. Armoros taught the loosing of spells, the counter-magic, the breaking of enchantments, an entire shadowcraft of curse and counter-curse. Barakiel taught the reading of the stars, astrology, the searching of the heavens for signs and fates. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Sariel taught the courses of the moon. One by one, the text says, the Watchers unveiled to mankind the closely guarded mechanisms of the cosmos, the movements of the sky, the powers of the herbs, the words that bind spirits, the secrets of metal and fire and fate. Linger over that catalogue for a moment, because there is a pattern in it that the ancient writer wanted us to see. Look at what each gift has in common. The reading of the stars, that is the attempt to know the future, to read fate before it arrives, to seize tomorrow's knowledge today. The cutting of roots and the casting of spells, that is the attempt to command the hidden forces of nature, to bend the powers of the world to private will. The working of metals, that is the attempt to multiply the strength of the human hand beyond what the body was given, to arm the will with edges it did not have. The painting of the face, that is the attempt to control how one is seen, to govern the perception of others. Every single one of the forbidden teachings is a grasping after a power not given. Every one is an attempt to seize control over something fate, nature, force, perception, that the young human race was meant to receive only slowly in its proper season, under the patient tutelage of heaven. The Watchers did not teach humanity new facts. They taught humanity new powers, and they did it before there was any wisdom to govern those powers. And that ungoverned power is precisely what corruption is. And notice, too, that the texts do not present these as fantastical, impossible arts. They are the foundations of civilization itself: metallurgy, medicine, cosmetics, astronomy, the calendar. This is the unsettling genius of the old story. It does not condemn some imaginary dark magic that has nothing to do with us. It condemns the very arts and sciences by which human societies are built. And it asks a question that grows more urgent, not less. With every passing century, what happens when a people receives the power to reshape its world before it has the wisdom to know what it should do with that power? The Watchers handed humanity the keys to civilization all at once, with no foundation of wisdom beneath them. And the answer to the question, the result of all that ungoverned power loosed upon a young and hungry world, would be the giants and the blood and the flood. Stop and consider what this means, because it is the heart of the whole tradition, and it is endlessly debated to this day. The crime of the Watchers, in its deepest sense, was not love, and it was not even lust. It was forbidden knowledge given out of season. It was the premature unveiling of secrets that humanity, in its youth, was not yet ready to bear. Knowledge is not evil. The stars are not evil. Medicine is not evil. Even the working of metal is not evil. But knowledge given by the wrong teacher for the wrong reason, before its time, knowledge stolen across a boundary that was meant to protect the very ones who received it, that knowledge becomes a poison. The Watchers did not damn humanity by withholding wisdom. They damned it by pouring out too much, too soon, with no foundation beneath it to hold its weight. There is an ancient and unmistakable echo here of the very first sin, in the very first garden. There, too, the temptation was knowledge. You shall be as gods, knowing. There, too, a boundary set by heaven was crossed in the pursuit of what lay on the other side. The Book of the Watchers is, in a sense, the story of the fall told a second time, on a vaster scale. In Eden, one couple reached for forbidden knowledge and lost paradise. On Mount Hermon, 200 heavenly beings poured forbidden knowledge down upon the whole earth, and what was lost this time would not be a garden, but the world itself. And while the secrets spread from village to village, from valley to valley, from one generation to the next, while the human race armed itself, painted itself, learned to curse and to read the stars and to bind the spirits of the air, something else was happening. something the marriages had set in motion and could not now be stopped. The wives of the Watchers had conceived, and what grew in them was not human. The transition from the world of order to the world of chaos does not happen at the oath. The oath is only the crossing of the line. The true horror, the consequence that turns a transgression into an apocalypse, begins to take shape slowly in the bodies of women in the months after the Watchers came down. The boundary had been broken. Now the world would have to live with what came through the breach. Think, for a moment, of those women for the old texts almost never do, and yet the whole catastrophe passed first through them. They had been chosen by beings of light, beings who descended from the sky in glory, who must have seemed to them like gods. What could a daughter of men do in the face of such a suitor? And then the wonder of it curdled, slowly, into something else. As the children within them grew too fast, grew too large, grew in a way no human child had ever grown. The texts hint at the agony of those births, at mothers who could not survive what they carried, at a generation of women who became the first victims of the breach, broken open by the very offspring the Watchers had given them. The descent that the old stories tell as a tale of angels and oaths and cosmic crimes began at the human level, as something far simpler and far more terrible. Women bearing children that were never meant to exist, and paying for it with their lives. The first blood spilled in the age of the giants was the blood of their own mothers. And what came through the breach were the giants. The children were born, and from the first they were wrong. Genesis gives them a single, untranslatable name, Nephilim, and most of our Bibles render it simply as giants. But the word carries more than size. It comes, the old scholars argued, from a root meaning to fall, or to cause to fall the fallen ones, or the ones who make others fall. From the very beginning, their name was a warning. These were not merely large men. These were beings whose very existence was a falling, a collapse of the order that had kept heaven and earth apart. They were the boundary made flesh. They were the breach, walking. But Genesis gives them a second name too, and this one is even more revealing, because it tells us how the rest of the world would remember them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown, the mighty men, the men of the name. In the Hebrew, the Gibborim, the heroes, the warriors, the champions, the ones whose names would be spoken with awe for generations. And the men of renown, literally, the men of the name, the famous ones, the ones whose stories would outlast them. Stop and feel the weight of that. The text is telling us that these monstrous offspring of the breach were not remembered by the nations as monsters at all. They were remembered as heroes. They were the demigods of the old myths, the half-divine champions, the larger-than-life warriors whose deeds the pagan peoples would sing of for thousands of years. This is one of the most quietly devastating ideas in the entire tradition, and it changes how you hear every old legend you have ever been told. Because if the men of renown were the Nephilim, if the half-divine heroes of the ancient world were the children of fallen angels and human women, then the great mythologies of humanity, the tales of demigods and titans and heroes born of gods who came down to lie with mortals, are not simply made-up stories. They are, in this reading, the distorted memory of a real catastrophe. Every culture that told of beings who were part god and part human, of giants in the deep past, of heroes of more than human strength and stature, of an age of legends before the Great Flood, that nearly every ancient people remembered in some form, all of it, the old writers believed, was the scattered and corrupted recollection of the days of the Watchers. The world remembered the giants, it just remembered them wrongly. It built temples to them, it sang their praises, it called renown what heaven called abomination. And that gap between how the breach was remembered by the nations and how it was judged by heaven is itself a kind of warning. The very things a culture most admires, the heroes it most exalts, the power it most celebrates, may be precisely the things that heaven looks upon with grief. The book of Enoch tells us how vast they were, and the number it gives is so enormous that later copyists could scarcely believe it and tried to shrink it in their translations. 3,000 cubits, one version says, a height beyond anything the natural world could sustain. Whatever the true figure, the meaning is plain. They grew beyond all proportion, beyond anything the earth was built to bear. They towered over the cities of men like living mountains, and as they grew, the world began to strain beneath them, the way a small body strains beneath an appetite too large for it. Because appetite is the thing the texts return to. Again and again, the giants were hungry, not hungry the way men are hungry, satisfied by a meal and content until the next. They were hungry in a way that could not be filled, because their hunger was not of this world, and the food of this world could never answer it. They had been fathered by beings who did not belong here, and they had inherited a need that the earth simply could not meet. So picture how it began. At first, the texts say, the giants consumed the labor of men. Everything that the human race grew and gathered and raised, they took. The harvests of whole regions vanished into them. The grain of the fields, the fruit of the orchards, the produce of years of patient human work, all of it swallowed, and still they were not full. The people gave and watched their children grow thin, and gave still more, and it was never enough. And when the harvests were gone, the giants turned to the herds. They devoured the cattle and the sheep, the flocks that the people depended on, the animals that meant the difference between life and starvation through the winter. The fields fell silent, the pastures emptied, and still the hunger of the giants was not answered. And then, and here the old text speaks a sentence that has chilled readers for 2,000 years, when there was nothing left to eat, the giants began to devour the people themselves. The very humanity they had been born from. They turned upon the villages and consumed the men and the women and the children. The earth's own monstrous offspring fed upon the earth's own people, and a terror without precedent settled over the whole world. There was nowhere to hide. There was nothing that could fight them. The instruments of war that Azazel had taught were useless against beings of such size. Whole communities simply disappeared. And when even that was not enough, when they had eaten the harvests and the herds and the people, the giants turned at last upon the wild beasts and the birds and the fish and the reptiles. They consumed the living world from one end to the other, and the book of Enoch records the final descent in a single, unforgettable line. At the end, the giants began to drink the blood. They consumed the life of every living thing, and the earth itself, soaked in the blood of its own slaughtered creatures, began to cry out. This is the corruption that Genesis is pointing to, in its careful, veiled way, when it says that the earth was filled with violence, and that all flesh had corrupted its way. It is not describing ordinary human wickedness. It is describing a world being literally devoured alive. The Hebrew word translated violence hamas means destruction, ruin, the tearing apart of what should be whole. The whole created order, which had once held so beautifully in its appointed boundaries, was being unmade. The food chain, the seasons, the relationship between humanity and the world it was meant to steward, all of it collapsing into a single, endless act of consumption. And imagine, for a moment, what it was to be an ordinary human being in those days, not a hero, not a patriarch, just one of the countless men and women trying to keep a family alive in a world that was being eaten. Imagine waking before dawn to work fields you knew you would not be allowed to harvest. Imagine teaching your children to listen for the sound of the ground trembling, the way other generations would teach their children to listen for thunder, because the trembling meant one of them was near. Imagine the slow arithmetic of starvation as the giants took the grain, and then the goats, and then the seed you had hidden for next spring. Imagine the silence that fell over a valley after the giants had passed through it, the empty houses, the cold hearths, the people simply gone. There were no armies that could stand against them. There were no walls high enough. The instruments of war that the Watchers had taught, the swords and the spears, were as nothing against beings the size of mountains. Humanity had been given the knowledge of weapons and the knowledge of its own helplessness in the same dark season. And so the prayers began, though the texts do not record them as eloquent prayers, only as a cry, a wordless rising lament from a species that could see no way out. The children of men cried out, and their cry went up, and it kept going up, because nothing answered it. Day after day the world grew worse, and day after day the heavens seemed silent, and the people learned the particular despair of those who suffer and cannot understand why help does not come. It would come, but not yet. And in the meantime they endured the unendurable, and their suffering was real, and it was vast, and it was the texts insist heard, even when it seemed to fall on a sky of iron. But here is where the deeper traditions add a dimension that even the giants' hunger cannot fully explain, because the corruption was not only physical, it was spiritual, and it spread the way a sickness spreads, through the knowledge the Watchers had given. Mankind had now been taught to make war, to work the secret powers of the earth, to bind and curse and read the fates. The world was not only being eaten by the giants from the outside, it was rotting from the inside, poisoned by wisdom it could not handle. The Watchers had loosed two catastrophes at once, a famine of the body in the giants, and a famine of the soul in the forbidden arts. And the two fed upon each other until there was almost nothing left of the world that God had called good. And this is the dimension that Genesis itself, in its terse way, chooses to emphasize over all the rest. For when the canonical text finally pronounces its verdict on that age, it does not speak of giants or watchers or forbidden teachings. It speaks of the human heart. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Every imagination, only evil, continually. It is one of the bleakest sentences in all of Scripture, and it describes not an external invasion, but an internal collapse, a corruption that had reached all the way down into the imagination, into the very place where thought begins, until there was nothing left in the human heart that turned, even for a moment, toward the good. The forbidden knowledge had not merely armed humanity, it had warped it. The arts of war and deception and the binding of spirits had become the whole texture of life, until cruelty was ordinary and violence was the air people breathed, and a child could be born into that world and know nothing else. There is a small, chilling window into that world preserved in Genesis just before the flood account, the Song of Lamech, a descendant of Cain, who boasts to his wives that he has killed a man for wounding him, a young man for striking him, and that if Cain would be avenged sevenfold, then Lamech would be avenged 70 and sevenfold. It is the first poem recorded in the Bible, and it is a song in praise of disproportionate vengeance, a boast of escalating slaughter. That is the spirit of the age the Watchers had helped to make, a world where a man composes verses to celebrate his own readiness to kill, where violence has become not a shame to be hidden, but a glory to be sung. The harvest of the forbidden teaching was not only the giants in the fields, it was the song in the human mouth. And it was that the corruption of the heart, the only evil continually of the human imagination, that finally broke the patience of heaven. And what of the Watchers themselves in the midst of all this? What were they feeling as they looked upon what they had made? This is one of the most poignant threads in the whole tradition, and it is worth dwelling on, because the old texts do not paint the fallen ones as simple monsters. They paint them as beings who got everything they desired and discovered too late that it was their own destruction. They had crossed the boundary out of longing. They had wanted closeness, beauty, the warmth of the world they had only ever watched from a distance. And what they received was a generation of devouring children they could not control and could not unmake, the slow ruin of the very world they had come down to be near, and the dawning, unendurable knowledge that they could never go back. The gates of heaven were closed behind them. The station they had abandoned could not be reclaimed. They had everything they had reached for, and it was ash. There is a particular kind of horror in that, not the horror of being denied what you want, but the horror of being given it, and watching it become a curse in your hands. The watchers had not been kept from the world out of cruelty. The boundary they were forbidden to cross had been, in its way, a mercy, a wall that kept two things apart precisely because they would destroy each other if they met. The line between the heavenly and the earthly was not an arbitrary rule. It was a truth about the nature of things, a recognition that some things cannot be joined without ruin. And the watchers learned that truth, the only way it can never be unlearned, by crossing the line and living in the wreckage. They had looked at the wall and seen only what it kept them from. They had not understood, until it was too late, that the wall was also what kept the world whole. Every boundary heaven sets, the old story quietly insists, is set in love, and the proof of it is what happens when the boundary is broken. The watchers got their wish, and their wish unmade the world, and there was no taking it back. That is the deepest sorrow in the tale, not punishment imposed from outside, but a longing fulfilled and curdled into catastrophe, a desire granted and discovered in the granting to have been the very shape of their doom. The Book of Giants, that astonishing and fragmentary text, preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls and once read across the ancient Near East, gives us the most intimate glimpse of this despair, because it tells the story not from heaven's side, and not from humanity's side, but from inside the camp of the giants themselves. And what it shows us is a household of monsters, slowly being visited by dreams of their own doom. The Book of Giants names the sons of Shemiaza, the chief of the Watchers, and they are giants among giants. Their names come down to us as Oya and Haya. And the heart of the book is a series of terrible dreams that begin to trouble the giants, visions sent into their sleep, warnings written in symbols they cannot fully read, but cannot shake off either. There is a haunting strangeness to the fragments of this book, recovered piece by piece from the caves above the Dead Sea, that comes from the very names that drift through it. For the world of the giants, as the Book of Giants remembers it, was not sealed off from the great legends of the ancient Near East, it bled into them. Among the giants named in the surviving fragments is one called Gilgamesh, the same name as the hero king of the oldest epic of Mesopotamia. And there is mention of a monstrous figure called Hobabish, an echo, the scholars believe, of Humbaba, the terrible guardian of the cedar forest whom Gilgamesh slays in that ancient epic. The writers of the Book of Giants were weaving the great pagan legends of the surrounding world into their own account of the antediluvian age, casting the famous heroes and monsters of the old myths as the giant offspring of the fallen Watchers. It is as if they were saying, all those tales the nations tell of mighty men and monstrous beings in the deep past, those are the dim and scattered memories of this, of the age of the giants, of the world before the flood. The whole mythological memory of humanity gathered up and set inside the story of Genesis 6. And these giants, for all their borrowed glory, are afraid. The book shows them not as triumphant heroes, but as creatures, slowly being unmade by dread. The dreams come, and they cannot escape them. One of the giants dreams of a great tablet rising from the water, and upon it names written, and as he watches, all the names are washed away, all but a few. Another dreams of a garden, lush and immense, and then of watchers coming down with axes and fire, cutting it all down until only a single root remains. They wake from these dreams shaken, and they gather to speak of them, these towering creatures sitting in council, trying to understand the doom that is being whispered into their nights. There is something almost unbearably human in the scene, the powerful, the monstrous, the seemingly invincible, lying awake in the dark, troubled by a sense of something coming that they cannot name and cannot stop. And the council that follows is one of the most poignant things in the whole tradition. Picture it, a gathering of giants, beings the size of hills, the terror of the whole earth, sitting together in the deepening dusk to confess that they are frightened of their dreams. The two sons of Shemyaza speak. Oyah tells of what he has seen and tries to read hope into it, and Haya answers. And the others press in, each turning the visions over, each trying to find some reading that does not end in their destruction. They are doing what every frightened soul does in the dark hours, searching for the interpretation that lets them sleep. But there is no such interpretation, and somewhere beneath their arguing, they know it. The dreams are not riddles to be solved. They are warnings to be heeded. And the giants, who cannot change what they are, who cannot undo their own monstrous birth, have nothing to heed the warning with. They can only wait. They can only dread. They are the first beings in the story to know that the flood is coming, and they are the ones who can do nothing at all to escape it. And they are right to be troubled. The dreams are true. The garden is the world. The felling is the flood. The single surviving root is Noah and his family, the one line that will be spared. The giants are dreaming their own annihilation night after night, and slowly the knowledge settles upon them that no strength, no size, no inherited power from their fallen fathers can save them from what is coming. So they do what desperate creatures always do. They seek out the one who might know. There was, in those days, a single human being who walked with God, a man named Enoch, the seventh from Adam, who had not given himself over to the corruption of the age, and who, the texts say, was taken up into the heavens and shown the secrets of all things. And in the book of giants, the giants send one of their own, a giant named Mahaway, flying across the world to find Enoch and to ask him to interpret the dreams. Imagine the strangeness of it. A creature of the breach, born of the union that broke the world, soaring over the ruined earth to seek out a single faithful man, begging him to read the meaning of a nightmare. And Enoch, the scribe of heaven, gives his answer, and his answer is judgment. The dreams mean exactly what the giants fear. There will be no reprieve. The destruction is fixed. The world will be washed clean. And the giants and their fathers and everything that came of the crossing of the boundary will be swept away. This is the world of Genesis 6, restored to its full and terrible scale. Not a vague age of human sinfulness, but a world held in the jaws of an apocalypse, devoured from without by the giants, poisoned from within by forbidden knowledge, haunted from above by dreams of a coming flood, and inhabited by fallen angels who have realized, far too late, that they have destroyed everything they loved. And it is into the heart of this ruined world that the Book of Enoch sends its most extraordinary figure, the one man who had not fallen, the scribe of heaven, walking among the bound and the doomed to deliver the verdict of the Most High. For the watchers, when the weight of what they had done began at last to crush them, did a thing that is almost unbearable to imagine. They did not repent. It was too late for repentance, and in their hearts they knew it. Instead, they turned to Enoch. They sought out the one righteous man, the one who walked with God, the one who alone among the children of men had been into the heavens and stood before the throne. And they begged him, these fallen sons of heaven, these beings who had once outranked him by an order of magnitude. They begged a mortal man to be their advocate. They asked Enoch to write a petition on their behalf, to carry their plea before the Most High, to ask, on behalf of the fallen, for forgiveness, for mercy, for some remission of the doom they could feel closing around them. Sit with the strangeness of that scene. The eyes of heaven, the immortal watchers, brought so low by their own choices that they could not even approach the throne they had abandoned, and so they turned to a man and asked him to speak for them because they no longer had the standing to speak for themselves. There is in this a portrait of what guilt does to a soul. It does not only condemn, it isolates. It cuts the sinner off from the very presence he most needs. The watchers had broken the boundary to get closer to the world, and the result was that they now stood farther from heaven than any creature had ever stood, unable even to lift their own voices to the one they had served. They needed a translator, they needed an intercessor, they needed a man. And Enoch agreed. He wrote out their petition. He recorded their plea for mercy, and then he went apart to the waters. And he sat down, and he read the petition aloud, and he waited, and as he waited, sleep came over him, and in his sleep the visions came. He was lifted up, the clouds called to him, the mist summoned him, the courses of the stars and the flashes of lightning sped him on his way. He was carried up into the heavens, into the very house of God, a structure of crystal and fire, its floor like fitted snow, its ceiling like the paths of the stars and the flashing of flame, with cherubim burning around it and a sea of fire surrounding its walls. And he passed through a first house, cold as ice, and into a second house greater than the first, built all of fire, until he came at last into the presence of the great glory, the one whose raiment was brighter than the sun and whiter than any snow, before whom none of the angels could enter or even look upon his face for the splendor and the majesty, and before whom the 10,000 times 10,000 who stood in attendance did not depart from him by night or by day. And there, in the presence of the Most High, Enoch received the answer he had carried the petition to obtain, and the answer was no. The verdict that Enoch was given to carry back is one of the most sorrowful passages in all the ancient literature, and it turns on a single devastating idea. "Go," the Most High told him, "and say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should be interceding for men, and not men for you." The order of things had been perfectly inverted, and that inversion was itself the measure of how far they had fallen. The watchers had been the higher beings, the ministers of heaven, whose place was to stand between God and humanity, to lift mankind's prayers upward and bring heaven's help down. That was their station. That was their glory. And now they had abandoned it so completely that the relationship had reversed. A man was being sent to plead for the angels, when it should always have been the angels pleading for men. And then the verdict itself, delivered through Enoch like a sentence read over the condemned. "Why have you forsaken the high and holy and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done as the children of earth, and begotten giant sons? You were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, and you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and have lusted after the blood of men, and produced flesh and blood, as those produce who die and perish." And so, the verdict continued, just as they had longed to become like the children of earth, so now they would share the fate of the children of earth, but worse and longer. Their giant sons would perish, their wives would die, and they themselves would find no peace. No peace. That is the phrase that tolls through the whole judgment like a bell, the phrase that Enoch was sent to deliver and that the watchers must have heard with a horror beyond anything physical. They had asked for mercy, for forgiveness, for the lifting of their doom, and the answer that came back, carried in the mouth of the mortal they had begged to speak for them, was that there would be no forgiveness, no remission, no peace, not now, and not ever. You will have no peace. They would watch their children destroy one another. They would watch the world they had crossed the boundary to embrace dissolve beneath the waters. And they would be bound in the darkness of the earth, not for a season, but for 70 generations, until the final judgment, and through all of it, no peace. The longing that had begun as a quiet ache at the edge of heaven had purchased an eternity without rest. Enoch carried that answer back down to them. Imagine him standing before the assembled watchers, this single, small, mortal figure, holding in his hands the verdict of the heaven they could no longer reach, and speaking it to them, "You who were holy and spiritual, you will have no peace," and watching it land, watching the last hope drain from beings who could not die and could not be forgiven and could not undo what they had done. It is one of the great tragic scenes of the ancient world, and almost no one alive today has ever heard it, because the book that contained it was set outside the scriptures and slowly forgotten. This is the world of Genesis 6 in its full and terrible depth. Not only an apocalypse of devouring giants and poisoned knowledge, but a spiritual catastrophe so complete that the highest beings in creation found themselves begging a man to save them, and were told that they could not be saved. The boundary, once broken, could not be mended from the wrong side of it, and the watchers, who had reached across the line out of love, would spend eternity learning the difference between the closeness they had wanted and the closeness they had destroyed. And then, at last, the cry that had been building since the first drop of blood soaked into the ground rose all the way to heaven. For the old tradition is insistent on this point, and it is one of the most beautiful and sorrowful images in the entire literature: the blood of the slain and the souls of the devoured, and the groaning of the tormented earth, all of it ascended. It rose up past the clouds, past the stars the watchers had abandoned, past the boundary they had broken, and it reached the gates of heaven, and it would not be silenced. The earth itself was crying out against what had been done to it. The very ground was lifting up a voice, pleading for an answer, and in heaven 4 beings heard it. They were the holy ones who had not fallen, the great archangels who had kept their station while their brothers went down to the mountain. The texts name them: Michael, the prince of the heavenly host; Gabriel, the messenger; Raphael, the healer; and Uriel, the light of God. And they looked down from the high places upon the world they had once watched together with the 200, and they saw what their fallen brothers had wrought. They saw the giants striding through the rubble of the cities. They saw the blood standing in the fields. They saw humanity dying by inches, crying out with no one to save it. They saw the secrets of heaven scattered like seed across a poisoned ground. And the 4 of them came before the throne of the Most High, and they spoke on behalf of a dying world. "You see what Azazel has done," they said, "how he has taught all unrighteousness on the earth and revealed the eternal secrets that were in heaven. You see what Shemiyaza has done, to whom you gave authority to rule over his fellows. They have gone in to the daughters of men, and have lain with them, and have defiled themselves, and have made known to them all sins. And the women have borne giants, and the whole earth has been filled with blood and unrighteousness. And now, behold, the souls of those who have died are crying out, and their cry has reached to the gates of heaven, and cannot cease, because of the lawless deeds which are wrought on the earth." And then, in words that go to the very root of the matter, the archangels asked the question that the whole apocalypse had been building toward, the question that every grieving heart in every age has asked when the world has gone wrong, beyond all repair: what should we do? They turned to the one who sees all things, and they asked him what was to be done about a creation that had been broken past mending. And in the silence after that question, in the long, suspended moment between the cry of the earth and the answer of heaven, the fate of the entire world hung in the balance. The Most High had heard, and he was about to respond. The answer came. And it came not as a single blow, but as a sentence handed down to each of the 4 archangels in turn, a fourfold verdict against everything that had crossed the boundary. The Most High did not act in haste, and he did not act in rage. He acted with the terrible precision of a judge who has heard every cry and weighed every deed. And the first thing he commanded was not destruction. It was mercy. For before the waters there had to be a survivor. The Lord turned first to Uriel, the light of God, the angel of the underworld and of the turning of the heavens, and he sent him down to a single man. "Go," he said, "to the son of Lamech. Go to Noah, and tell him what is coming. Tell him that the end of all flesh is at hand, that the earth is about to be washed clean, that everything that breathes will be swept away by a deluge that will cover the whole world. But tell him also how to be saved. Tell him to build a vessel. Tell him to gather his family and the creatures of the earth 2 by 2, and to seal them within it. For from this one righteous line the world will begin again. Pause on this, because it is the hinge of the whole story, and it is so easily missed. Even at the moment of the world's undoing, heaven's first concern was preservation. The flood was not the erasure of everything. It was a cutting back, a pruning, a clearing of the poisoned ground so that something living might still grow. The single root that the giant saw in his dream, the one thing left standing in the felled garden, that was the mercy hidden inside the judgment. Noah was the proof that the Most High did not want the death of the world, but its cleansing. And that distinction between erasure and cleansing is everything. Then the Lord turned to Raphael, the healer, and gave him the second commission, and it was directed at the worst of the fallen, at Azazel, who had taught humanity to make the sword and to wear the mask, who had scattered the secrets of war and deception across the earth. Bind Azazel hand and foot, the Lord commanded, and cast him into the darkness. And Raphael was told to make an opening in the wilderness in a desert place the text calls Dudael, and to hurl Azazel into it, and to cover him with jagged and broken rocks, and to leave him there in the dark, his face covered so that he might see no light, until the great day of judgment when he would be cast into the fire forever. And then comes one of the most extraordinary lines in the whole book of Enoch, a line that quietly reframes the entire catastrophe. And the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin, all of it. The whole ruin of the world laid at the feet of the one who unveiled the forbidden knowledge. And then, having bound the teacher of corruption, Raphael the healer was commanded to do the thing his name was made for, heal the earth which the angels have corrupted, and proclaim the healing of the earth, that they may heal the plague. Even here, at the height of judgment, the language is the language of medicine. The world is not being destroyed, it is being treated. The poison is being drawn out so that the patient might live. And there is a thread here that reaches forward into the very heart of Israel's worship, into a ritual so strange that it has puzzled readers for as long as it has been read. For Azazel does not vanish from the Bible after Genesis. His name surfaces again in the book of Leviticus, in the instructions for the holiest day of the year, the Day of Atonement. On that day, 2 goats were chosen. One was sacrificed to the Lord, and the other was sent away, alive, into the wilderness, into the desert, bearing upon its head all the sins of the people, driven out into the wasteland to Azazel. The sins of the people, laid upon a living thing, and sent out into the desert, to the place of the bound one, to Azazel in his wilderness prison. The connection is unmistakable once you have read the book of Enoch. The bound teacher of corruption, lying beneath the jagged rocks in the desert place, to whom all sin was ascribed, and the goat, year after year, carrying the people's sin out into that same desert, out to him. The desert, in the ancient imagination, was the realm of the bound and the unclean, the dwelling of the demons and the place of the curse, the anti-world beyond the edge of the ordered land. And it was there, to that place of exile and binding, that the sin of the people was sent back to its source, back to the one to whom all sin had been ascribed, back to Azazel. Sit with how deep this runs. The crime of the watchers was not a curiosity tucked away in a forgotten book. It was woven into the very fabric of the sacred calendar, into the holiest ritual of the year. Every day of atonement, the memory of Azazel and his desert binding was enacted again, the sin of the people driven out to the place where the corrupter lay chained. The breach of Genesis 6 left a mark on Israel's worship that lasted 1,000 years and more, a living goat, walking out into the wilderness toward the bound one beneath the rocks. The third commission went to Gabriel, and it concerned the giants, those devouring children of the breach, who could not be allowed to survive the cleansing. But the Lord did not send a single angel to slay them, mighty as the archangels were. Instead, he did something stranger and in its way more fitting. He turned the giants against one another. "Go, Gabriel," he said, "against the children of fornication, the children of the watchers, and set them one against another, that they may destroy each other in battle." The giants, born of violence, taught nothing but appetite and slaughter, would devour each other as they had devoured the world. The very nature that made them monstrous would become the instrument of their end. And so a war broke out among the giants, sons against fathers, brother against brother, and the towering creatures who had terrorized the earth fell upon one another and tore each other down, until the ground that had drunk the blood of men now drank the blood of the giants too. There is a terrible justice in the shape of that judgment, and the old writers knew it. The giants were not slain by an outside force, descending upon them in glory. They were not struck down by a thunderbolt or swept away by an angel's sword. They were given over to themselves, to the very nature their fathers had bred into them, and that nature did the rest. They had been made of nothing but hunger and force. So hunger and force turned inward and consumed them. This is one of the oldest and deepest insights in all of Scripture, and it appears again and again from this point forward, that the truest punishment of evil is often simply to let it have its way to the end, to let it run its full course, to let it do to itself what it has been doing to everything else. The giants did not need to be destroyed from above. They only needed to be left alone with what they were, and what they were could not survive its own company. And so the children of the watchers, who had been the terror of the whole earth, who had seemed invincible, who had towered over the cities like living mountains, fell not to heaven's armies, but to each other. The dream that had troubled their sleep, the vision of the garden cut down, and the names washed from the tablet, was coming true around them, even as they fought. They had dreamed their own end, and now they were living it, blade against blade, brother against brother, the blood of the giants soaking into a world that had no more tears left to weep for them. And then the fourth commission, the heaviest of all, went to Michael, the prince of the host, the greatest of the faithful angels. And his task was to deal with Shemiaza and the rest of the watchers themselves. The 200 who had sworn the oath, who had broken the boundary, who had fathered the giants and taught the secrets. "Bind them fast," the Lord commanded. "Bind them beneath the hills of the earth, in the valleys, in the darkness, for 70 generations, until the day of their judgment is consummated, until the eternal judgment is accomplished." And there they would lie, the eyes of heaven that had looked too long upon the earth, bound in the deep places of the world they had ruined, forced to witness first the slaughter of their own beloved children, and then the drowning of everything they had crossed the boundary to be near. And this is the part that the old writers lingered over, with a sorrow that still reaches across the centuries, because the punishment of the watchers was not, at its heart, physical. The chains and the darkness were real, but they were not the worst of it. The worst of it was that they were made to watch. They were beings created to behold the world, and their final torment was to behold the consequence of their fall, to see their giant sons cut each other to pieces, to see the waters rise over the cities and the fields and the mountain top where they had sworn their oath, to see everything they had loved swept into the deep, and to know with a clarity that would never dim that they had done this, that the love they had reached for had become the ruin of everything, that they had wanted closeness and had purchased annihilation. There is no fire in that punishment, not yet. There is only the unbearable weight of seeing what you have destroyed and being unable to look away. The eyes of heaven, sealed open forever upon their own catastrophe. And then the rain began. The old texts and the Genesis account together describe the coming of the flood with a strange and solemn slowness, and if you read them with care, you can feel the whole world holding its breath. For the deluge did not begin with a storm, it began with a stillness. Imagine the last morning of the old world. The giants are gone now. fallen in their war, their vast bodies cooling in the ruined valleys. The watchers are bound in the dark, and over the silent, blood-soaked, devoured earth, a hush descends, the kind of hush that comes before something immense. The birds, the texts suggest, fell quiet, stopping their songs in the middle of the refrain. The wind died. The light itself seemed to thicken and still. For one long moment, the whole creation seemed to pause at the edge of its undoing, the way the sea draws back from the shore before the wave returns. And then, the text says, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Understand what this meant to the people who first heard it. To the ancient mind, the world was held together by those very boundaries we spoke of at the beginning, the waters above, held back by the great vault of the sky, the waters below, held down beneath the foundations of the earth. The dry land, the world of the living, existed in the narrow space between two oceans, kept safe by the firmament that divided them. And now, in judgment, those boundaries were not merely crossed, they were broken. The vault of the sky cracked open, and the waters that had been held above since the first day of creation came pouring down. And the deep places of the earth split apart, and the waters that had been held below came surging up. The two oceans that the world had been built to keep apart rushed together, and the thin, bright space of the living world was swallowed between them. This is the deepest meaning of the flood, and it is breathtaking once you see it. The watchers had broken a boundary, the line between heaven and earth, between the divine and the human. And so the punishment fit the crime with a terrible exactness. All the boundaries broke. The world that had been made by separation was unmade by the collapse of separation. The crossing of one line undid the holding of every line. The cosmos itself came apart at the seams, and the waters returned, and the earth went back, for a time, to the formless deep from which it had first been called. Watch it happen slowly, the way the old account asks you to. At first, only the rain, but a rain unlike any the world had known, falling not in a storm that would pass, but in a flood from above that did not cease, hour after hour, day after day, until the very idea of a sky began to dissolve into water. And beneath the earth a deep groaning, a shifting in the foundations, and then the springs of the great deep bursting open one after another, the buried waters surging up through the cracking ground, the two seas reaching for each other, the rivers swelling and then leaving their courses, the valleys filling, the low places vanishing, first the villages along the water, the fields in the bottomlands, gone beneath a rising brown tide. And the people fleeing upward, to the hills, to the high ground, climbing as the water climbed, gathering on the shrinking islands of the world as the sea rose to meet them. There would have been a terrible quiet to it in the end. The old texts suggest not the violence of a single great wave, but the slow, patient, unstoppable rising, inch by inch, hour by hour, until the last high places were no longer high, and there was nowhere left to climb. And the waters rose. They rose over the fields where the harvests had been devoured. They rose over the ruins of the cities. They rose over the bodies of the giants. They rose over the high places, and at last over Mount Hermon itself, over the very summit where 200 watchers had once descended in the night and sworn their cursed oath beneath the stars. The mountain of the breach vanished beneath the sea, and there was no mark left upon the face of the deep to show where the world had broken. And through it all, sealed within his wooden vessel, riding upon the surface of a world dissolved into ocean, one man and his family and a remnant of the living creatures were carried, alive, upon the very waters that drowned everything else. The single root, preserved, the mercy inside the judgment floating upon the abyss. For 40 days and 40 nights the waters fell, and for many months they covered the earth. And when at last they began to recede, and the vessel came to rest, and the man stepped out onto a washed and silent world, the age of the watchers, the age of the giants, the age of the breach, was over. The boundary had been broken, and the world had paid for it with its own dissolution. But the world had not ended. It had been cleansed, and it would begin again. Picture the long, slow turning of it. The rain stops. For the first time in 40 days there is silence above. And then a wind, the old text, uses the same word that hovered over the waters at the very beginning of creation, the breath of God moving over the deep, and slowly, slowly, the waters begin to go down. The deep places close, the springs are stopped, the vault of the sky is sealed again. And inch by inch the drowned world rises back toward the light, the mountaintops emerging first, dark and streaming, like the first land lifting out of the first sea on the first morning of the world. It is creation happening again. It is the second beginning. And there is the dove, that small, patient image the story gives us, the bird sent out across the endless water to search for a place to rest, returning at first with nothing, finding no foothold in a world still drowned, and then, at last, coming back with a freshly plucked olive leaf in its beak, a green leaf, a living thing, growing again, somewhere out there in the receding waters. The first sign that the world was not only being uncovered but was alive again, that the cleansed earth would bear fruit, that the long judgment was turning finally toward mercy. There is a tenderness in that image that has comforted human beings for 3,000 years. The dove, the olive branch, the small green proof that after the deepest flood, life returns. And when the man at last stepped out onto the dry and silent earth, heaven did a thing that the whole story had been waiting for. It made a promise, and it sealed the promise with a sign, and the sign, fittingly, was a boundary. For the Most High set the rainbow in the clouds, and declared that never again would the waters become a flood to destroy all flesh, that the seasons would not cease, that seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, would hold as long as the earth endured. Do you see what that sign was? It was the re-establishment of the boundaries. The whole catastrophe of Genesis 6 had been the breaking of a boundary, and the whole judgment had been the collapse of every boundary as the waters returned. And now, at the very end, heaven's first act in the new world was to set the boundaries back in place and to swear that they would hold. The rainbow arching between the waters above and the earth below was a covenant written across the sky. The line will hold. The deep will stay in its place. I will not let it cross again. The story that began with a broken boundary ends with a promised one. That is its deepest shape and its deepest comfort. The waters had answered the cry of the earth. The blood that had risen to the gates of heaven was washed away by the waters that came down from them. And in the great silence that followed the flood, the world lay clean and empty, anew scarred by what had happened, but no longer poisoned by it. The judgment was complete, but the story, as the oldest traditions insist, was not entirely over, for something had survived the flood that the waters could not drown. And what it was, and where it went, is the last and strangest secret of Genesis 6. The giants died. Their bodies fell in the war that Gabriel kindled among them, and what the war did not finish, the waters covered. But the giants were not only flesh. They had been born of a union between two worlds, a heavenly father and an earthly mother. And the old traditions wrestled with a haunting question that the flood could not answer. When a being made of both heaven and earth dies, what becomes of it? The book of Enoch gives a chilling reply. The bodies of the giants, it says, returned to the earth and were destroyed. But the spirits that had lived within them did not die, because they had come, in part, from the spiritual realm of their fathers. And these spirits, set loose from their monstrous bodies, could not ascend to heaven, for heaven was not their home, and the gates were closed to them. And they could not rest in the earth, for the earth was not fully their home either. So they were left to wander, homeless, bodiless, belonging to neither world, and cast out of both. These wandering spirits, the text says, became the evil spirits upon the earth, and from that day forward they would afflict humanity, tormenting and tempting and oppressing the children of men, never resting, never satisfied, carrying still the insatiable hunger of their giant origin into a world that could no longer see them. This is, in the oldest Jewish tradition, the very origin of demons. Not fallen angels, as later popular belief would come to assume, but something stranger and sadder, the orphaned ghosts of the giants, the unhoused spirits of the breach, wandering the cleansed earth in search of a rest they will never find until the final judgment. And the Book of Jubilees adds a final, chilling detail to this, an answer to a question you may already be asking. If the demons are the spirits of the dead giants, and the flood was meant to cleanse the world, then why are there still demons? Why was the whole horde of them not bound away forever, along with their fathers, the Watchers? Jubilees tells us, after the flood, it says, these unclean spirits began at once to lead astray and corrupt and destroy the new generations of Noah's descendants, just as they had the old. And Noah cried out to heaven for relief, begging that his children be protected from the spirits that afflicted them. And so the holy angels were commanded to bind the evil spirits away. But the chief of the spirits, the one Jubilees calls Mastema, the accuser, the adversary, came before the Lord and made a request. He asked that a portion of the spirits be left to him, that they might remain on the earth to carry out his work, to tempt and to test and to exercise their power over the children of men. And the request was granted, in part. A fraction of the spirits, 1 in 10, the text says, were left free upon the earth under the authority of Mastema, while the other 9 parts were bound away to the place of judgment. So the demons that remain in this ancient reckoning are a remnant, a tenth of the old horde, deliberately left loose, permitted to walk the world. Not because heaven could not bind them, but because, in the strange economy of the old texts, even the spirits of the breach were given a role to play in the testing of humanity. The wound of Genesis 6 was not fully closed even after the flood, even after the binding, because a portion of it was allowed to remain open on purpose, woven into the very fabric of the world we still inhabit. And that, the old writers believed, is why the long night of the world is haunted still. A tenth of the giants never left. And so, the flood did not entirely close the wound of Genesis 6. It drowned the bodies, but it loosed the spirits. The boundary had been broken on Mount Hermon, and even the waters of the deep could not fully seal it again. Something of that old transgression remained loose in the world, a residue of the breach, and the ancient writers believed it was loose still. But there is another survival, even stranger than the wandering spirits, and it hides inside the very verse we began with, in 4 words that have puzzled readers for as long as the text has existed. Go back and read Genesis 6 again, slowly, and watch for them. There were giants in the earth in those days, yes, and also afterward. And also afterward. After what? The whole point of the flood was that the giants were destroyed. The whole purpose of the deluge was to wipe the breach and its monstrous offspring from the face of the world. And yet the text, in the very sentence that introduces the giants, slips in this quiet, unsettling phrase, and also afterward, as if to warn us, before the flood has even arrived, that the giants would not stay gone, and they did not. This is the part of the Bible that most readers have never connected, because it is scattered across books written centuries apart, but once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The giants come back. Or rather, after the flood, when the descendants of Noah have spread across the earth and entered the land that would become the Holy Land, they find it already inhabited by giants. By a people the text called the Anakim, the sons of Anak, and the Rephaim, and the Emim, and the Zamzumim, and the Zuzim, a whole catalogue of giant clans, towering peoples, the dread of every nation around them. When Moses sends 12 spies into the land to scout it before the conquest, 10 of them come back broken with terror, and the thing that has broken them is the giants. We saw the Nephilim there. They report using the very same word from Genesis 6, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Grasshoppers. The spies stood before these beings and felt themselves to be insects. The word Nephilim, the word for the antediluvian giants, the children of the watchers, surfaces again on the far side of the flood, attached to the peoples of the land. The breach had not been fully sealed. The bloodline somehow had returned, and the texts give these returning giants faces and names. There is Og, the king of Bashan the last, the Bible says, of the remnant of the Rephaim, the last of the old giant stock. And the book of Deuteronomy preserves a detail so specific, so strange, that it reads almost like a museum label. Og's bed was made of iron, and it was 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, a bed for a being far larger than any man, kept as a marvel, a relic of the last of the giants, displayed in the city of the Ammonites, so that the people might come and see how vast the old kings had been. And there is the most famous of them all, Goliath of Gath, the champion of the Philistines, a man whose height the text records with the same fascinated precision, whose armor weighed more than a man could lift, who stood in the valley and defied the armies of the living God until a shepherd boy with a sling brought him down. Goliath and his brothers and the other giant warriors of Gath are described as descendants of the Rapha, the same giant stock, the lingering remnant of the old breach, still standing in the land generations after the flood was meant to have ended them. Do you see what this does to the story? The conquest of the promised land, which we are so often taught as a simple matter of one nation displacing another, takes on, in this older reading, a far stranger and more cosmic dimension. It becomes the continuation of the war, begun in Genesis 6. The flood had cleansed the world, but the breach had reopened. The giant bloodline had crept back into the earth, and now the descendants of the saved remnant were sent to finish what the flood had left undone, to drive the last of the Nephilim from the land, to close the wound that kept reopening. The whole long, bloody history of the giants in the Holy Land, the Anakim, the Rephaim, Og, Goliath, is the long aftershock of that single night on Mount Hermon. And also afterward, the text warned us, the breach, once opened, does not easily close. It keeps reaching forward into the world of David and Goliath, into the deep past of a people who could not finally escape the shadow of what the Watchers had begun. And there is one more figure who stands in that gap between the flood and the conquest, one more echo of the old breach, and he appears just a few chapters after the flood, in the very generation of Noah's descendants. His name is Nimrod, and Genesis describes him with a phrase that should make you sit up, now that you know how to hear it. He began to be a mighty one in the earth, the text says, and the word is Gibber, the very same word used for the mighty men, the Gibberim, the heroes of renown who were the children of the Watchers. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And it was Nimrod, the text tells us, who founded the first great kingdoms after the flood Babel, and the cities of the land of Shinar, the very place where humanity would gather to build a tower to reach the heavens. In a second great act of grasping across the boundary, a second reaching for what was not given, the old traditions could not help but see in Nimrod a return of the old spirit, the mighty one, the Gibbor, the builder of empire and the raiser of towers, the first after the flood, to gather human power into something vast and proud and reaching upward. The breach had been cleansed, but the hunger of the breach, the hunger to be mighty, to be renowned, to cross the line and seize the heavens, had survived in the human heart, and it surfaced again in the very first generations of the new world, in the mighty hunter who built Babel. This is the thread that runs from Mount Hermon all the way through the Bible. The recurring temptation to cross the boundary, to grasp the forbidden power, to make a name, to reach the heavens by force. The Watchers did it first, descending. Babel tried it next, ascending. And in between and ever after stand the giants and the Gibberim and the mighty hunters, the men of renown, each one a fresh outbreak of the same ancient sickness, the refusal to keep one's station, the reach across the line. The story of Genesis 6 is not a single closed episode. It is the first and clearest instance of a pattern that the whole of Scripture will trace again and again down to the very end. Now you can begin to see why this passage has been called the verse that breaks the Bible. Because once you have read it in full, once you have followed it down into the book of the Watchers and the book of Giants and the book of Jubilees, and then forward again into the Anakim and the Rephaim and the valley where Goliath fell, you can no longer read the rest of Scripture the same way. This single buried account changes the shape of everything around it. Consider the choice it forces upon every careful reader. For 2,000 years, those who studied this text have divided, broadly, into three camps. There are those who say the sons of God were simply the godly line of Seth, and the daughters of men were the corrupt line of Cain, and that the whole story is about the intermarriage of the righteous and the wicked, a reading that keeps the supernatural safely out of it. There are those who say the sons of God were powerful human kings and tyrants, dynastic rulers who claimed divine descent and took whatever women they wished, a reading that makes the giants merely mighty men and the sin merely human pride. And there are those who read the text as the most ancient interpreters did, as the apostles and the earliest church did, as the writers of Enoch and Jubilees did, that the sons of God were heavenly beings, that they truly descended, that the boundary between heaven and earth was truly broken, and that the consequences were truly cosmic. And here is the thing: you cannot hold all three at once. The text forces a decision about what kind of world the Bible describes. Is it a world that is essentially natural, in which all the strangeness can be explained away as metaphor and dynasty and bloodline? Or is it a world that is genuinely open at the top, a world in which the heavenly and the earthly really do touch, in which boundaries between realms are real things that can be honored or broken, in which the cry of spilled blood really does rise to the gates of heaven and is really heard? Genesis 6 will not let you sit between those two worlds. It hands you 4 verses and demands that you choose which universe you are living in. And the phrase at the center of it all, sons of God, only deepens the difficulty because of where else it appears. This is not a phrase the Bible uses loosely. In the book of Job, when the text describes a great assembly in heaven, it says that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, a gathering of heavenly beings, a divine council, standing in the presence of the Most High. The same phrase. In the Psalms, there is talk of a council of holy ones, an assembly of the heavens, beings who surround the throne and over whom God presides as a king presides over his court. And in the Song of Moses, in Deuteronomy, in one of the oldest poems in the entire Bible, there is a startling line about how the Most High, when he divided the nations and set their boundaries, did so according to the number of the sons of God, as though the peoples of the earth were apportioned among a host of heavenly beings, each given a sphere, each set over a nation, beneath the rule of the one above them all. When you read Sons of God in Genesis 6, against that background, against Job's heavenly assembly and the divine council of the Psalms and the apportioning of the nations in Deuteronomy, the supernatural reading does not look like a strange fringe interpretation at all. It looks like the plain sense of the words. The sons of God were the members of the heavenly host, the divine council, the beings who stood in the presence of the Most High, and Genesis 6 is telling us that some of them left that council, abandoned their station among the assembly of heaven, and came down. The whole architecture of the ancient biblical world, a Most High God presiding over a court of heavenly beings, each with its station, each with its boundary, is what makes the fall of the Watchers legible. They were not minor spirits. They were sons of God, members of the council, and they forsook it. That is the scale of what Genesis 6 is describing, and it is why the verse, once understood, reorganizes your sense of the entire book around it. That is why the books were removed, or at least it is the heart of why. The book of Enoch was scripture to many of the earliest believers. It is quoted directly in the New Testament. The letter of Jude cites Enoch by name, prophesying the coming of the Lord with his holy ones to judge the ungodly. The same letter speaks of the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but abandoned their own habitation, and who are now kept in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day, which is, almost word for word, the binding of the watchers from the book of Enoch. The Apostle Peter writes of the spirits in prison, of angels who sinned and were cast down and committed to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept for judgment, set in the very context of the days of Noah and the flood. The earliest Christians knew this tradition. They built upon it. They assumed it. Read those New Testament lines again with the Book of the Watchers in mind, and they snap into focus with startling clarity. Angels who did not keep their proper domain. The Watchers' whole crime, in a single phrase, the abandoning of their station, the forsaking of the boundary they were meant to keep. Who abandoned their own habitation? They left their place in heaven and came down to a habitation that was not theirs. Kept in everlasting chains under darkness, the binding of Shemiaza and the 200 beneath the hills of the earth, in the dark until the judgment. And Peter setting it all in the days of Noah, in the days of the flood, exactly where Genesis 6 sets it, exactly where the book of Enoch sets it. These were not vague references to some general angelic fall in the distant past. The writers of the New Testament were pointing directly at the story we have been tracing, the descent of the Watchers and the world of the giants and the flood that drowned them, and they were treating it as known, as settled, as part of the shared memory of the faith. They expected their readers to recognize it. The story that most modern readers have never heard was, to the first generation of the church, common knowledge. And that is the strangeness we are left with. A story that was once so well known that an apostle could allude to it in a single phrase and be understood, a story woven into the holiest ritual of Israel, quoted in the scriptures of the early church, preserved in books that were read as holy across the ancient world, became, over the centuries, a story so thoroughly forgotten that to tell it now feels like uncovering a secret. Nothing was hidden. Exactly. It was simply allowed to fall silent, and the silence held for so long that the recovery of the story feels, to us, like the breaking of a seal. And then, slowly, over the first several centuries, it fell away. As the faith grew and systematized, as it became uncomfortable with the story of angels lusting after women and fathering monsters, as the literal supernatural reading grew strange to a more philosophical age, the Book of Enoch was quietly set outside the canon almost everywhere. The Sethite interpretation, the safe one, the human one, rose to dominance. The giants became metaphors. The Watchers became allegory. And the verse that breaks the Bible was sanded down into 4 obscure lines that most readers now skim past without a second thought, never knowing that they are passing the ruins of an entire vanished world. It is worth being honest about how this happened, because it was not a single dramatic act of suppression. There was no council that gathered to burn the Book of Enoch, no edict that struck it from every shelf. It was quieter than that. And in a way sadder, the slow drift of a tradition out of fashion, the gradual hardening of a consensus that this story was an embarrassment best left unread. Influential teachers in the early centuries argued that the sons of God must mean the godly line of Seth, precisely because the alternative heavenly beings taking human wives seemed to them unworthy of Scripture, too close to the pagan tales of gods who lusted after mortals. The reading that had once been universal among the earliest believers came to be treated as naive, even dangerous, the kind of thing a sophisticated faith ought to grow out of. And so the books that carried the older reading were left to fade. They were not copied as often. They were not read in the assemblies. They slipped from Scripture into Apocrypha, from Apocrypha into obscurity, until in most of the world they had vanished so completely that for many centuries it was thought the Book of Enoch was lost entirely, known only by the few quotations of it that survived, embedded in other writings. And then it came back, and the manner of its return is itself almost a parable. In the 18th century, a Scottish traveller journeying in Ethiopia found that the church there had never let the book go. They had preserved the entire book of Enoch in their own ancient language, treasured as scripture, while the rest of the world had forgotten it even existed. He brought copies back, and the lost book was lost no longer. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, in the dry caves above the Dead Sea, shepherds and then scholars uncovered the scrolls of an ancient community, and among them, in fragments 2,000 years old, were copies of the Book of the Watchers and the Book of Giants, in the original Aramaic, exactly the texts that explained Genesis 6. The story that had been buried was unburied, twice, once out of Ethiopia, once out of the desert sand, as though it would not consent to stay forgotten. As though the verse that breaks the Bible was determined, in the end, to be read again. And in every age since, there have been those who went looking, who sensed that there was more behind those 4 verses, and who pulled on the thread, and felt the whole hidden world behind it begin to move. Perhaps you are one of them now. So what does it mean, this ancient story of a boundary broken and a world drowned? Why has it haunted the human imagination for 3,000 years, refusing to be forgotten no matter how often it was set aside? Perhaps because it speaks to something we have always known, somewhere beneath our knowing. The story of the Watchers is, at its core, the story of knowledge given out of season of secrets, unveiled before there was wisdom to hold them. And is that not the oldest fear of our species, and the most modern one too? We are a people who have always reached across boundaries we were warned not to cross. We have always wanted the knowledge on the far side of the line, the fire, the blade, the secret of the atom, the writing of the code, the splitting of the very stuff of life. And we have always discovered, again and again, that knowledge without the wisdom to bear it does not save us. It devours us. The Watchers gave humanity the sword and the mask, the spell and the star chart. The powers of heaven poured down upon a world too young to hold them, and the result was a generation of giants whose hunger could never be filled. The ancient writers were not telling us a story about the past. They were telling us a story about ourselves, in every age, whenever we grasp at a power before we have grown wise enough to wield it. And the giants, the children of the breach, hungry beyond all filling, consuming the world, and never satisfied, are they not also a mirror? Is there not something in us that recognizes that hunger, the appetite that takes and is never full, the desire that consumes the harvest, and then the herd, and then the people, and then the very blood of life, and still cries out for more? The old writers gave that hunger a body 3,000 cubits tall and set it loose upon the world, but they knew where it really lived. It lived and lives in the human heart that has lost its boundaries. This is the deep wisdom hidden in that strange and buried verse. The world is good when its boundaries hold. The waters above stay above, and the waters below stay below, and the living world flourishes in the bright space between them. Heaven keeps its station, and earth keeps its station, and the eyes that watch over us watch in love and not in hunger. And when those boundaries are honored, when each thing keeps to its place and reaches only for what is given, and does not grasp across the line at what was never meant to be taken, then the world is whole, and the world is safe, and life can grow. The Watchers fell because they would not keep their station. The giants devoured the world because they had no station to keep. And the flood was, in the end, the world's boundaries reasserting themselves, washing away everything that had refused to stay in its proper place. And perhaps there is one more thing in the story worth carrying with you, the strangest comfort of all, hidden inside the darkest part of the tale. Remember the Watchers at the end, begging Enoch to intercede for them, and being told that they should have been interceding for us. Remember how the order had been inverted. The higher beings, who were meant to lift humanity toward heaven, brought so low that a mortal had to plead for them. There is a sorrow in that. but there is also a strange dignity granted to us within it. For the whole drama turns on the worth of human beings. The watchers fell because they could not bear to remain apart from us. The giants rose because of a union with us. The flood came because the cry of human suffering reached the gates of heaven and would not be silenced. From the first verse to the last, the story insists that what happens to humanity matters at the very highest level, that the blood of an ordinary person crying out from the ground is heard in the throne room of the cosmos, that the suffering of the small and the nameless can move heaven to act. The watchers looked down at humanity and saw something they desired enough to destroy themselves for. They were wrong in what they did with that desire. But they were not wrong that the thing they were looking at was precious. You are looking, right now, at the same creation they could not look away from, and you are part of it, and it is held, and it is seen. The old story does not leave us with monsters and drowning. It leaves us with the conviction that the world is watched. Once, it was watched in hunger, and that watching nearly ended everything. But the hunger was bound away beneath the hills, and the breach was washed clean, and the watching that remains the patient attention of heaven over the long night of the world is watching of a different kind. Not the gaze that wants to consume, but the gaze that wants to keep. Not the eyes of the fallen, fixed on what they could take, but the eyes that kept their station, fixed on what they were given to protect. That is the watching that holds the world together. And it has not blinked, and it has not turned away, from that first morning of creation to this very night. And so we come to the end of the story, and to the quiet that always follows the deep waters. If you have stayed with this tale to its close, then let the weight of it settle gently now, the way the floodwaters settled at last over a cleansed and silent world. There is no need to carry it as a burden. The old stories were never meant to frighten us into sleeplessness. They were meant to give shape to the things we already feel in the dark, the sense that there are boundaries we are not meant to cross, the sense that the world is held together by something we did not make and cannot fully see, the sense that even in judgment there is mercy, and even in the deepest flood, there is always a single root left standing, a vessel riding upon the waters, a reason to begin again. For that is the truth that survives. When the giants have fallen, and the waters have receded, and the watchers lie bound in the dark places of the earth, the world was not ended. It was cleansed. And the one who sent the waters sent also the ark. The same heaven that judged the breach preserved the remnant. The boundary that was broken was, in the end, restored, and behind it, the eyes that watch over the world were watching still, only now in love again, only now as it was always meant to be. So, as the night comes down around you, and the lights of the day grow soft and far away, let your thoughts drift back over the deep waters of that ancient world, and let them grow still. The giants are long gone. The waters are long receded. The mountain where the oath was sworn lies far behind us, beneath the seas of time. And the world we wake to in the morning is a world that began again, washed clean, given a second dawn. Let the names settle now, one by one, into the quiet. Shemyaza, who could not bear to remain apart. Azazel, who taught the sword and the painted face. The 200, who swore their oath upon the snow. The giants who dreamed of their own ending and could not escape it. Enoch, who walked with God and carried heaven's hardest answer down to the fallen. Noah, the single root, riding the deep in his wooden vessel while the old world dissolved around him. They are all far away now, all of them, gathered up into a story that is finished, a story whose ending we already know. The breach was opened, and the breach was closed. The cry went up, and the cry was answered. There is nothing left in it now to fear, for the old story was never told to keep us awake. It was told the way all the deepest stories are told, to give a shape to the great shadows that move at the edge of our understanding, so that having seen them named and bounded and brought to their proper end, we might set them down and rest. The darkness in the tale is real, but it is bounded. It has a beginning, on a mountaintop long ago, and it has an end, beneath the cleansing waters. And on the far side of those waters there is morning, and a clean and silent earth, and a covenant, and a sky no longer breaking but holding as it was always meant to hold. Remember, as you sink toward sleep, that the boundaries still hold. The waters above stay above. The living world rests, as it has always rested, in the quiet space between. And whatever watches over the long night of the world watches not with hunger now, but with patience and with care. You are not one of the fallen, and you are not one of the drowned. You are one of the living, in the world that came after, in the bright, narrow space between the waters, held in the gaze that keeps its station. The hunger that devoured the old world is bound beneath the hills. The eyes that watch over you now do not want to take anything from you. They only want to keep you, through the dark, until the morning. The flood has passed. The earth is clean. The single root has grown into a forest, and you are one of its leaves, resting now in the dark, held in a world that was made by separation and saved by mercy. So let the day go. Let the story go. Let the great waters close gently over your waking thoughts, the way they once closed over the old and broken world, not to destroy you, but to carry you quietly toward the far shore of the morning. Sleep now. The boundary is whole, and the light, as it always has, keeps its silent watch over the deep.